Welcome to another episode of Mastering Cybersecurity, developed by baremetalcyber.com. Let's dive in. A common mistake in account security is assuming that the password and the second authentication factor remain the main barriers throughout a user's entire visit. They are critical at the moment of login, but most applications do not ask the user to prove identity again before every click, message, download, or change. Instead, the application creates a session that represents the successful login and allows the user to continue working. Session hijacking occurs when an attacker steals or reuses the information that represents that session. The practical question is therefore not only whether someone can discover the victim's password, it is whether someone can obtain the session material that the application already trusts. By the end of this episode, you should be able to explain how session hijacking works, why it may bypass both a password and multifactor authentication, MFA, what signs defenders can look for, and which controls reduce the opportunity for a stolen session to remain useful. A session is the temporary relationship an application maintains with an authenticated user. After the application verifies the user's identity, it issues or recognizes a session identifier, often stored in a browser cookie or represented by a token. That identifier tells the application that later requests belong to a user who has already completed the login process. Session hijacking is the unauthorized use of that identifier to act within the victim's existing session. The central distinction is between stealing proof used to log in and stealing proof that login has already happened. A password and an MFA response are authentication factors. A session cookie or token is usually the application's continuing evidence that authentication succeeded. The terms are often confused because both can lead to unauthorized account use, but they affect different parts of the access process and may require different defensive responses. Most web sessions begin when a user submits valid authentication information and the server creates a new authenticated state. The server may keep that state in its own session store and give the browser a random reference value, or it may issue a signed token that carries information the server can validate. The browser then sends the relevant cookie or token with later requests, so the application does not have to interrupt the user for another login each time. In many systems, possession of that value is enough to make a request appear authenticated. This is why session material is often described as a bearer credential. The application trusts the party that presents it, unless additional checks show that the context has changed or the token is no longer valid. The session makes normal use practical, but it also creates a security dependency. If the identifier is copied, the application may not immediately know that a different person is presenting it. A session cookie and an access token serve related purposes, but they are not always identical. A cookie is a browser storage and transport mechanism that can hold a session identifier and send it automatically to a matching website. A token is a broader term for a value that represents authorization, identity, or both, and it may be stored or transmitted in several ways. Some tokens are short-lived and narrowly scoped. Others remain valid for longer periods or allow access to many functions. The security concern is not that every cookie is dangerous or that every token can be reused anywhere. The concern is whether a particular value acts as sufficient proof for a particular application. Its usefulness to an attacker depends on scope, expiration, server validation, and the privileges already granted to the user. Understanding those limits helps defenders judge the likely impact instead of treating all session artifacts as equal.
Session information can be exposed through several broad weaknesses, and the defensive lesson does not require turning those weaknesses into attack instructions. Malicious software on an endpoint may read browser data or observe an authenticated user's activity. A harmful or overprivileged browser extension may gain access to information it should not have. A web application flaw may allow untrusted content to interact with session data, especially when protective cookie settings are missing. Poor transport protection can expose information while it is moving between systems, and careless application design can place sensitive tokens in locations that are copied into logs, browser history, or monitoring tools. Some phishing techniques also attempt to capture an authenticated session rather than only a password. These paths are different, but they share one result. The attacker obtains a value the application already accepts, so the protection effort must address endpoint security, application design, transport, and session handling together.
The ability to bypass another password prompt or MFA challenge comes from the separation between authentication and session management. Authentication establishes identity at a point in time. Session management decides how long the application will continue trusting that result and what must happen before the user is challenged again. If an attacker presents a valid session token, the application may see no reason to repeat the original authentication ceremony. This does not mean MFA failed or provided no value. It means the attacker targeted the trusted state created after MFA succeeded. The same distinction explains why changing a password does not always end every active session immediately. Some systems revoke existing sessions after a password change, while others allow them to continue until expiration or explicit termination. Effective protection therefore requires controls for both the login event and the life of the session that follows it. Defenders rarely receive an alert that simply announces a stolen session. They usually have to infer the problem from behavior, context, and technical evidence. Useful signals may include the same session appearing from sharply different network locations, a sudden change in device characteristics, access that continues after a user reports logging out, or sensitive actions that do not match the account's normal pattern. Repeated use of an old token after a newer one was issued can also be meaningful when the application rotates session identifiers. None of these signals proves hijacking by itself. Mobile networks, privacy services, travel, browser updates, and shared infrastructure can all create legitimate changes. Good detection combines session identifiers, timestamps, internet protocol IP addresses, device information, user actions, and authentication history. The aim is to identify a pattern that deserves investigation without treating every environmental change as malicious. Before we continue, this is a brief promotional message. This episode is brought to you by the Bare Metal Cyber Academy. The Academy provides a place for people who want to continue developing practical cybersecurity knowledge through clear, structured education. Topics such as authentication, session management, access control, and digital risk become more useful when they are explained as connected parts of real security decisions. You can visit baremetalcyber.com to explore the Academy and see the learning opportunities currently available. The goal is straightforward education that helps you understand why controls work, where their limits appear, and what questions to ask next. Now, let's return to how session hijacking changes the way we evaluate account protection. The impact of session hijacking usually reflects the privileges and reach of the captured session. A token for a low-privilege account may expose only a limited set of functions, while a session associated with administrative access can create far greater consequences. The attacker may be able to read information, change settings, initiate transactions, create additional access paths, or perform other actions already permitted to the victim. The session does not automatically grant more authority than the application recognizes, but it can make existing authority available to the wrong person. Duration also matters. A token that expires in minutes creates a different window of exposure from one that remains valid for days. Scope matters as well. A session limited to one application is different from a token accepted across several connected services. Risk, therefore, depends on what the session can reach, how long it remains trusted, and how quickly it can be detected and revoked. Several misunderstandings weaken the response to session hijacking. The first is treating it as nothing more than password theft. A password reset may be appropriate, but it may not remove an already active session unless the system is designed to revoke it. The second is assuming that Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure, HTTPS, prevents every form of session theft. HTTPS protects data in transit between the client and the service, but it does not clean an infected device, repair an application flaw, or control what a harmful extension can access. The third is concluding that MFA is ineffective. MFA still blocks many attempts that depend on stolen passwords, but it cannot protect a session token that the application accepts after authentication. The fourth is treating all cookies as proof of compromise. Many cookies contain harmless preferences, while only particular values represent authenticated state. Accurate labeling leads to a more focused investigation and a more effective control choice. Prevention begins with reducing the chance that session material can be exposed or reused. Applications should use strong encrypted transport and should avoid placing sensitive tokens in addresses, logs, or other locations where they can spread beyond the intended request. Browser cookies that carry authenticated sessions should use protective settings such as secure, HTTP only, and an appropriate same-site policy. These settings limit particular paths of exposure, but no single flag solves every problem. Session identifiers should be unpredictable, rotated when authentication or privilege changes, and invalidated when they are replaced. Access tokens should have the narrowest reasonable scope and lifetime. Client devices need protection because a well-designed server cannot fully compensate for malware operating inside an authenticated browser. Developers also need to prevent application flaws that allow untrusted content to access or misuse authenticated state. Defense works best when each layer reduces a different opportunity for theft or replay.
Limiting reuse is just as important as preventing theft. Short session lifetimes can reduce exposure, although expiration must be balanced against usability and the needs of the application. Idle timeouts end sessions that have not been used, while absolute timeouts place a maximum limit on trust, even if activity continues. Sensitive actions can require fresh authentication rather than relying entirely on an old session. This is often called step-up or reauthentication, and it is especially useful before changes to credentials, recovery methods, payment information, or administrative settings. Some systems can also evaluate whether the device, network context, or behavior has changed enough to justify another challenge. More advanced designs may use device-bound credentials or tokens that are harder to replay from another environment. These controls are not perfect, and overly rigid checks can disrupt legitimate users. Their purpose is to make a copied session less useful and easier to recognize.
When session hijacking is suspected, incident response should focus on the session itself as well as the account. Revoking active sessions, invalidating refresh tokens, and forcing reauthentication can stop continued use more directly than a password change alone. The organization should still evaluate whether the password or other factors were also exposed, because the attacker may have more than one form of access. Investigators should review authentication events, token issuance, session activity, device evidence, application logs, and changes made during the suspected period. They should also determine whether the exposure came from the user's device, the web application, an integration, a logging pipeline, or another part of the environment. Recovery may require removing malicious software, correcting application flaws, restoring altered settings, and notifying affected parties according to established procedures. The response is complete only when the trusted session state has been removed and the source of exposure has been addressed. A practical way to evaluate an application is to follow the full session lifecycle from creation to termination. Ask what proves identity at login, what session value is issued, where that value is stored, how it travels, and what the server checks each time it is presented. Then determine how long it remains valid, whether it rotates after important events, which actions require fresh authentication, and how administrators can revoke it. Test the design conceptually with one question. If someone copied this value, what else would the application require before allowing meaningful action? A strong answer may include a short lifetime, narrow scope, contextual checks, device-bound protection, or reauthentication for sensitive functions. Also verify what happens after logout, password change, account disablement, privilege reduction, and incident response. This lifecycle view turns session hijacking from an abstract threat into a set of specific design and operational decisions. Session hijacking is the unauthorized reuse of the information that keeps a user authenticated after login. It can bypass another password prompt or MFA challenge because the application is not being asked to authenticate the attacker from the beginning. It is being shown a session value that already represents a completed authentication event. The correct defense, therefore, extends beyond strong passwords and MFA. It includes secure token storage and transport, careful application design, limited session duration and scope, reauthentication for sensitive actions, useful detection, and reliable revocation. The correct response also extends beyond changing the password, because an active session may remain trusted until the system explicitly ends it. When you evaluate account security, examine both doors: the login process that creates trust and the session process that preserves it. The practical decision is to ensure that copied session material alone cannot remain a silent, long-lived substitute for the user.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.